You dropped the glass again? Those 5 words destroyed everything I thought I knew about my own son. But what he didn't know was that I was about to drop something much more valuable. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this story sounds familiar, please just leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep sharing these truths that so many of us carry in silence. My name is Margaret Ann Walker, and at 79 years old, I've learned that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who make you feel the most invisible. It was a Tuesday morning in Chicago, the kind where autumn fog clings to the windows of my small brick house on Maple Street. The same house where I raised 2 children, where I bandaged scraped knees and celebrated first steps, where I stayed up countless nights with sick babies and worried teenage hearts. The kitchen still smells faintly of the cinnamon rolls I used to bake every Sunday morning, back when my family actually came home for Sunday dinners. My hands were trembling more than usual that day. I hadn't slept well. The arthritis in my knees had kept me awake, and my mind had been racing with worry about things I couldn't control anymore. Simple things that used to be automatic now required careful concentration, reaching for dishes, turning doorknobs, remembering which medication to take when. I was at the kitchen sink, carefully rinsing out a water glass, one of the good crystal ones my mother had given me as a wedding gift 53 years ago. Each piece in that set held memories. Holiday toasts, celebration dinners, quiet evening conversations with my late husband Harold. I treasured those glasses because they were among the few things I had left that connected me to happier times. But my fingers, still stiff from sleep and medication, couldn't maintain their grip. The glass slipped, tumbling toward the porcelain sink in what felt like slow motion. The sound it made when it shattered was sharp and final, like something precious breaking that could never be repaired. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glittering fragments scattered across the white porcelain, feeling a familiar wave of frustration and sadness wash over me. It wasn't just about the glass. It was about everything I seemed to be losing piece by piece. My independence, my usefulness, my place in the world I'd helped create. That's when I heard the front door open. Heavy footsteps crossed the hardwood floor of my living room, moving with the casual confidence of someone who felt entitled to enter without invitation. David, my 47-year-old son, appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his expensive navy suit from his job at the consulting firm downtown. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his tie precisely knotted. Everything about him projected success and control. He looked at me standing there among the broken glass, and his expression wasn't concern or compassion. It was annoyance. The kind of look you'd give a malfunctioning appliance that had disappointed you one too many times. "You dropped the glass again?" he said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, as if he was commenting on the weather rather than speaking to his mother, who was clearly upset. Again, that word hit me like a physical blow. It implied this was a pattern, a recurring failure on my part. It suggested that I was becoming a problem that needed to be managed, rather than a person who deserved patience and understanding. No. "Are you hurt, Mom?" "No." "Let me help you clean that up." No acknowledgement that accidents happen to everyone, regardless of age. Just disappointment, and the subtle suggestion that I was somehow failing at the basic task of being human. David had been a tender child once. I have a shoebox full of cards he made me for Mother's Day, constructed from construction paper and decorated with crayon hearts, each one declaring in shaky handwriting that I was the best mom in the world. I remember the way he used to run to me when he fell off his bicycle, seeking comfort in my arms. I remember reading him bedtime stories, his small head heavy against my shoulder as he fought sleep to hear just one more chapter. But that little boy had grown into a man who seemed to view my aging as an inconvenience, my occasional struggles as evidence of incompetence rather than the natural process of getting older in a body that had served me faithfully for nearly 8 decades. "I'm sorry," I whispered, already reaching for the dustpan I kept in the cabinet below the sink. "I'll clean it up." David glanced at his expensive watch. The Rolex his wife Melissa had bought him for their last anniversary, the one that cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. "Actually, Mom, I need to talk to you about something." Something in his tone made my stomach clench with apprehension. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation. This was the voice he used when he had made a decision that would affect my life, without consulting me first. I carefully began picking up the larger pieces of glass, wrapping them in paper towels to avoid cutting myself. My hands were still shaking, making the task more difficult than it should have been. David watched me struggle for a moment, then continued speaking as if my physical discomfort was irrelevant to whatever important matter had brought him to my home uninvited. "Melissa and I have been talking," he began, and immediately I knew that whatever followed would not be in my best interest. Melissa, his wife of 15 years, had never made any effort to include me in their family. I was tolerated at best, treated like an obligation rather than a beloved grandmother and mother-in-law. "We think it might be time to start considering some changes to your living situation." Changes to my living situation. The euphemism hung in the air between us, clinical and cold. He wasn't talking about helping me install grab bars in the bathroom or organizing grocery delivery. He was talking about taking away my independence, my home, my autonomy. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "There are some really nice facilities in the area," he continued, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "Places where you'd be around people your own age, where there's medical staff available if you need help, where you wouldn't have to worry about incidents like this." Incidents. He was referring to the broken glass as an incident, as if it was evidence of my inability to care for myself, rather than simply an accident that could happen to anyone. The irony wasn't lost on me. David wanted me to be around people my own age. The same David who never called unless he needed something, who hadn't invited me to a family dinner in over a year, who made me feel like a burden rather than a person worth spending time with. He wanted to solve his guilt about neglecting me by paying someone else to provide the care and attention he couldn't be bothered to offer himself. As I continued cleaning up the broken glass, cutting my finger on a sharp edge that drew a small line of blood, I realized that something inside me had shifted. The pain wasn't just from the tiny cut on my finger. It was from the dawning recognition that my own son saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. That night, after David left with promises to look into options and send me some brochures, I sat in my living room surrounded by 53 years of memories. Photo albums filled with pictures of birthday parties, graduations, holidays, handmade gifts from grandchildren, cards from friends who had moved away or passed on, evidence of a life fully lived, of love given freely and generously. But as I looked around that familiar space, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become invisible in my own life, a ghost haunting the edges of a family that had moved on without me. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of my bedroom closet, staring at a small wooden box I kept on the top shelf. Inside were receipts, bank statements, and canceled checks. Evidence of 30 years of sacrifices that my children had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. I pulled the box down with trembling hands and sat on the edge of my bed, the morning light filtering through lace curtains that I'd sewn myself when money was tight and store-bought anything felt like a luxury. One by one, I examined the documents that told the story of a mother who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. $15,000 for David's college tuition when his scholarship fell through senior year. I remember working double shifts at the diner where I waitressed, my feet swollen and aching. Harold already gone for 2 years and the life insurance barely covering the mortgage. David had cried on the phone, devastated that he might not graduate. I didn't hesitate. I emptied my retirement savings account and handed him a check, telling him it was an early inheritance. "Mom, I'll pay you back as soon as I get a good job," he had promised, hugging me tight at the bank. That was 25 years ago. The subject of repayment never came up again. $8,500 for Heather's wedding dress and reception decorations, when her future in-laws suddenly withdrew their financial support. I had been so excited to help my daughter have the perfect day. I drove to 3 different states to find the exact flowers she wanted, spent weeks hand-sewing beads onto her veil because the designer version cost too much. The wedding was beautiful. Heather looked radiant. I felt proud and useful. In the photos from that day, I'm standing slightly apart from the main family group, wearing the same navy dress I'd worn to Harold's funeral, because it was the only formal outfit I owned. Heather had suggested I try to find something more festive, but she knew I couldn't afford a new dress after paying for her reception flowers. $12,000 to help David and Melissa with the down payment on their first house when they were newlyweds. They had found their dream home but come up short on the deposit. I liquidated a CD that Harold and I had been saving for 20 years, money we'd planned to use for our retirement travels that never happened because cancer took him before we could see Europe together. "This means everything to us, Mom," Melissa had said, though she couldn't quite meet my eyes when she accepted the check. "We'll never forget this." But they did forget. When they moved to their second house 3 years later, a bigger one in a better neighborhood, they didn't mention that I had made their first home possible. When they hosted their first neighborhood barbecue, I wasn't invited. When they had their kitchen renovated, using equity from the house I had helped them buy, they didn't think to show me the finished result. $6,200 for emergency car repairs when Heather's transmission died, and she couldn't get to work. She was a single mother then, struggling to support little Lily while finishing nursing school. I didn't have $6,200, but I borrowed against my house. The house Harold and I had worked 30 years to pay off. "I don't know what I would do without you, Mom," Heather had sobbed into the phone. "You're saving my life." But when she graduated nursing school and got her first good job, the celebration dinner didn't include me. "It's just going to be a small thing," she explained. "You understand, right?" I understood that I was good enough to solve problems, but not good enough to share in the joy that followed. The receipts kept coming as I sorted through the box. Groceries I'd bought and delivered when money was tight for them. Utility bills I'd paid when they fell behind. Christmas gifts for my grandchildren that cost more than I spent on myself all year. Babysitting services that I provided for free while they built their careers and social lives. For 25 years I had been their safety net, their backup plan, their solution to every financial crisis. But I had never been their priority, their first call with good news, their chosen companion for celebrations. I remembered the Christmas 3 years ago when I spent $400 on gifts for David's family, carefully chosen toys for my granddaughter Emma, a cashmere scarf for Melissa, a bottle of expensive scotch for David. I wrapped each present with beautiful paper and handwritten cards expressing my love. On Christmas morning, I sat alone in my living room, waiting for the phone to ring. They were having Christmas at their house that year, and David had said they'd call me after they opened presents. The call came at 4 p.m. "Thanks for the gifts, Mom," David said quickly. "Emma loved the dollhouse. Sorry we couldn't have you over. Melissa's parents came in from Denver unexpectedly." But I had seen Melissa's parents arriving on Facebook 2 days earlier. In the background of Emma's Christmas morning photos, I could see other relatives, family friends, neighbors. Everyone except me. I hung up the phone that day and realized I had been demoted from family member to gift-giving obligation. The pattern had been building for years, so gradually that I hadn't noticed until the weight of it became unbearable. Every crisis brought desperate phone calls and tearful requests for help. Every resolution brought distance and silence until the next emergency arose. When David's consulting firm was struggling 5 years ago, he called me 3 times a week, sometimes crying about the possibility of losing everything. I listened for hours, offered encouragement, and quietly transferred $3,000 from my savings to help with his mortgage payment during the worst month. When his business recovered and he started earning more money than ever before, the phone calls stopped. He was too busy, too successful, too surrounded by important people to need conversations with his 74-year-old mother. When Heather went through her difficult divorce, I was her primary emotional support. She called every night for 6 months, sobbing about her ex-husband's betrayal, her fears about raising Lily alone, her worries about starting over at 35. I absorbed her pain, offered practical advice, and provided free childcare so she could attend court hearings and lawyer meetings. After her divorce was finalized and she started dating again, she didn't have time for our long phone conversations anymore. She was rebuilding her social life, exploring her newfound independence, creating a new identity as a single woman. There wasn't room in that exciting new narrative for a mother who reminded her of the difficult times she wanted to forget. I thought about Harold then, about how he used to warn me about giving too much without requiring anything in return. "You're teaching them that you don't have needs," he would say gently when I sacrificed my own comfort for theirs. You're teaching them that your love comes with no expectations. But I had believed that sacrificial love was the highest form of motherhood. I thought that if I gave generously and consistently, if I never made demands or expressed disappointment, my children would naturally want to include me in their lives out of gratitude and affection. Instead, I had trained them to see my love as an unlimited resource that they could draw from without reciprocation. I had become a utility rather than a relationship, useful in emergencies, unnecessary in good times. As I sat surrounded by evidence of my own generosity, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking. That had happened so gradually I barely noticed. This was something else. This was the sound of my self-respect finally demanding to be heard. I had been asking myself the wrong question for years. Instead of wondering why my children didn't appreciate me more, I should have been asking a different question entirely. Was I used? The answer sat in my lap in the form of canceled checks and credit card statements. The answer was written in birthday cards I'd sent but never received. The answer was reflected in Christmas mornings spent alone while my children celebrated with people they'd chosen to prioritize over the woman who had made their lives possible. Yes, I had been used. Systematically, consistently, lovingly. And the most painful part wasn't that they had used me. It was that I had made it so easy for them to do it without guilt, without consequence, without ever having to acknowledge what they were taking from me. That evening, I called Lily, my 8-year-old granddaughter, just to hear a voice that still held genuine affection for me. She answered on the second ring, breathless with excitement. "Grandma, I was just thinking about you. I found a ladybug in the garden and I named her Margaret after you because she's beautiful and she takes care of all the plants." For the first time in days, I smiled. Lily still saw me as someone worth thinking about when I wasn't standing right in front of her. She still associated me with beauty and care rather than obligation and inconvenience. "I love you, sweet girl," I told her. "I love you too, Grandma. More than ice cream." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop waiting for my children to remember my worth. I was going to show them what happens when someone invaluable disappears from their lives. The microaggressions started so small, I almost missed them. Like drops of poison in clear water, they were nearly invisible until they accumulated enough to kill something inside me. It was the way Melissa would introduce me at school events. "This is David's mother." Never, "This is Margaret," or "This is Emma's grandmother." Just David's mother, as if I had no identity beyond my relationship to her husband, as if my 79 years of life experience, my decades of work and sacrifice and love, could be reduced to a biological connection to someone else. It was the way David would edit his stories when I was present, carefully omitting details that might include me or acknowledge my contributions. Last spring, when their neighbors complimented their beautiful garden, David launched into an elaborate explanation of his landscaping vision and weekend efforts. He never mentioned that I had spent 3 days on my hands and knees, planting every bulb and seedling because my arthritic fingers were still steadier than his for delicate work. It was the way conversations would stop when I entered a room, not because they were discussing anything secret, but because my presence somehow disrupted the natural flow of their adult interactions. They would pause, smile politely, then resume talking about topics they assumed wouldn't interest me. Restaurant reviews, vacation plans, workplace gossip about people I'd never meet. But the discovery that shattered what remained of my illusions came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I arrived at David's house unexpectedly. I had been driving past their neighborhood after a doctor's appointment when I remembered that Emma had mentioned feeling sick the night before during our brief phone call. As her grandmother, I felt compelled to check on her, maybe bring some homemade chicken soup if she was still under the weather. I knocked on the front door, but no one answered. David's car was in the driveway, and I could hear voices coming from the backyard. Assuming they were outside enjoying the unusually warm fall day, I walked around to the side gate. That's when I heard my name. They were having a barbecue. Not a large party, maybe 8 or 10 people I didn't recognize, adults and children scattered across their beautifully maintained deck. David was manning the grill, wearing the apron I had given him last Father's Day. Melissa was arranging appetizers on the outdoor table, laughing at something someone had said, but it was the conversation I overheard that made my blood freeze in my veins. Such a drain on our time, Melissa was saying to another woman, her voice carrying the casual tone people use when discussing minor inconveniences. David's mother is getting to that age where she needs constant attention. The calls, the emergencies, the guilt trips? Guilt trips. She called my occasional requests for help guilt trips. Has she considered assisted living? The other woman asked sympathetically. We've brought it up, David replied from his position at the grill, flipping burgers with practiced ease. But you know how these older folks get. Stubborn. Convinced they can still handle everything themselves. These older folks. He was talking about me like I was a generic problem, rather than the woman who had raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him. The worst part, Melissa continued, lowering her voice but not enough to prevent me from hearing every devastating word, is how she just shows up sometimes. No call, no warning. Like last week when we were trying to have a romantic dinner. She rang the doorbell with some story about being in the neighborhood. The romantic dinner. I remembered that evening clearly. I had spent all day making David's favorite chocolate cake for his birthday, which they had apparently celebrated without me earlier. When I brought it to their house, hoping to at least share a slice with my son on his special day, Melissa had answered the door in her bathrobe, looking annoyed. Oh, Margaret, we weren't expecting anyone tonight. David had appeared behind her, also in casual clothes, looking uncomfortable. Thanks for the cake, Mom. We'll save it for tomorrow. I had assumed they were having a quiet evening at home. Now I realized they had been having an intimate birthday celebration that deliberately excluded me, the woman who had given birth to the man they were celebrating. Maybe it's time for an intervention, suggested another voice, a man I didn't recognize. Sometimes you have to be firm with elderly parents, set boundaries. An intervention, against me, as if my love for my family was an addiction that needed to be treated. The money thing is getting out of hand too, David said, and my heart stopped completely. She keeps trying to give Emma cash for her allowance, like we can't afford to support our own daughter. It's embarrassing, the money thing. He was complaining about my modest gifts to my granddaughter. $5 or $10 here and there because I wanted Emma to have some spending money and know that her grandmother cared about her happiness. And she insists on bringing food to every gathering, Melissa added with an exasperated laugh. Homemade casseroles and desserts when we've already planned the menu. It's sweet, I guess, but it makes everyone uncomfortable. Sweet, I guess. My decades of cooking expertise, my desire to contribute to family meals, reduced to an awkward inconvenience that made people uncomfortable. I stood frozen behind that gate, listening to my own family discuss me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Every kind gesture I had made, every attempt to stay connected to their lives, had been interpreted as intrusion or manipulation. The final blow came when Emma, my precious 8-year-old granddaughter, spoke up from wherever she was sitting. Why can't Grandma just live somewhere else with other old people? Then she wouldn't be sad all the time. Sad all the time. Even my granddaughter had noticed my loneliness. But instead of inspiring compassion, it had apparently become another source of family frustration. That's exactly what we're working on, sweetheart, David replied gently. Grandma will be much happier with people her own age. I backed away from that gate as quietly as I could, my legs shaking so badly I wasn't sure they would carry me to my car. Once inside my Honda, I sat in their driveway for several minutes, trying to process what I had just heard. They wanted me gone, not just relocated, eliminated from their daily concerns. My presence in their lives had become something to be endured rather than cherished. My love had been reframed as neediness, my generosity as intrusion, my loneliness as manipulation. The drive home passed in a blur of tears and traffic lights. I kept replaying their words, searching for some interpretation that would make them less cruel, some context that would excuse their casual dismissal of my feelings. But there was no alternative explanation. I had heard my family's true opinion of me, expressed with the comfortable honesty people use when they believe they're speaking privately. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that grew cold while I stared at my phone. Every number in my contacts list suddenly felt like a potential source of embarrassment. How many other people saw me as David and Melissa did? How many of my attempts at connection had been secretly resented? I thought about my sister Dorothy, who lived in Florida and called me every Sunday. Were those calls acts of love, or was she also just tolerating an obligation? I thought about my neighbor Mrs. Chen, who sometimes invited me for coffee when she saw me working in my garden. Was she being genuinely friendly, or did she see me as a lonely old woman who needed charity? The paranoia was almost worse than the original betrayal. David and Melissa's words had poisoned not just my relationship with them, but my confidence in every other human connection I thought I could trust. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom that night feeling older than I had ever felt before. Not just physically older. My joints always ached, my hands always trembled slightly, but older in my soul, worn down by the accumulated weight of being unwanted by the people I had spent my life serving. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling Harold and I had painted together 30 years ago, I found myself asking a question that had never occurred to me before. What would happen if I just stopped? Stopped calling to check on them, stopped offering help, stopped showing up with gifts and food and grandmotherly concern, stopped being available for their emergencies and convenient for their schedules. What would happen if Margaret Ann Walker simply faded out of their lives the way they apparently wanted her to? The thought should have terrified me. Instead, for the first time in months, it brought me something that felt almost like peace. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't going to fade away quietly. I wasn't going to make their lives easier by eliminating myself from their concerns. I was going to show them exactly what they were losing, and I was going to start by doing something I had never done in 47 years of being David's mother. I was going to say no. The phone rang at 9:15 a.m. David's number appeared on the screen, probably calling to ask me to babysit Emma while he and Melissa attended some social function that didn't include grandmothers. For the first time in my adult life, I let his call go to voicemail, and in that moment of silent rebellion, something inside me began to come back to life. The voicemail David left was exactly what I expected: casual, entitled, and completely oblivious to my newfound resolve. "Hey Mom, it's me. Melissa and I need to attend a work function Saturday night. Important clients, you know how it is. Can you watch Emma? We'll drop her off around 5 and pick her up Sunday morning. She's been asking about making cookies with you anyway. Call me back." No, please. No acknowledgement that I might have plans of my own. No consideration that watching an 8-year-old overnight might be challenging for a 79-year-old woman with arthritis. Just the assumption that I would be available, grateful for the opportunity, and ready to serve. I deleted the message and didn't call back. By Wednesday, David had called 3 more times. Each voicemail grew slightly more impatient, though he maintained the veneer of casual expectation. By Friday morning, his tone had shifted to something approaching concern. "Mom, I've been trying to reach you all week. Are you okay? We really need an answer about Saturday. Please call me back." I was more than okay. For the first time in months, I was sleeping through the night without anxiety about what crisis might require my attention. I was eating breakfast without checking my phone for urgent requests. I was discovering what it felt like to live without the constant weight of other people's needs pressing down on my shoulders. Saturday evening arrived, and at exactly 5:17 p.m., I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through my living room window, I watched David and Melissa emerge from their BMW, looking confused and slightly annoyed. Emma bounced between them, carrying a small overnight bag decorated with cartoon unicorns. They knocked on my front door with the confident authority of people who had never been denied access before. I sat in my kitchen, sipping tea and listening to their increasingly insistent attempts to get my attention. "Mom," David called through the door. "We know you're in there. Your car is in the driveway." More knocking. Melissa's voice sharp with irritation. "Margaret, we're going to be late. Please open the door." Then Emma's small voice, confused and hurt. "Grandma, are you mad at me?" That almost broke my resolve. Almost. But I reminded myself that Emma's disappointment was the consequence of her parents' assumption that my time belonged to them, not my failure to provide free babysitting services. After 20 minutes of intermittent knocking and increasingly frustrated conversations on my front porch, I heard Melissa's voice rise to a level that probably disturbed my neighbors. "This is absolutely ridiculous. She's being completely childish." David's response was muffled, but his tone suggested he was trying to calm his wife while maintaining his own composure. Eventually, I heard car doors slam again, and the sound of their BMW pulling out of my driveway with more force than necessary. The silence that followed felt like victory. Sunday morning brought consequences I hadn't anticipated. My phone started ringing at 7:30 a.m. Not David this time, but Heather, calling from her apartment across town with a level of panic in her voice I hadn't heard since her divorce proceedings. "Mom, what's going on? David called me in hysterics saying you won't answer your phone, and you abandoned Emma last night. He said they had to cancel their entire evening and they think something's wrong with you mentally." Mentally? Of course. A woman who stopped providing free services must be suffering from cognitive decline. "Nothing's wrong with me, honey," I said calmly, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "I simply wasn't available to babysit." "But Mom, David said he left you multiple messages asking you to watch Emma. Why didn't you call him back?" "Because I had other plans." It was a lie, but it felt powerful to say. I had spent Saturday evening reading a novel I'd been trying to finish for months, taking a long bath with lavender salts, and going to bed early without worrying about anyone else's schedule or needs. Those were plans, even if they weren't the kind of plans my children would consider legitimate. "What plans?" Heather asked, her skepticism evident even through the phone. "Personal plans," I replied, offering no further explanation. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Heather alternating between concern for my well-being and frustration with my apparent selfishness. She used words like, "unlike you," and "out of character," and "worried about your judgment," as if my decades of reliability had created some kind of binding contract that prevented me from ever saying no. "David thinks you might be having some kind of episode," she said finally. "Maybe we should make an appointment with your doctor, just to make sure everything's okay upstairs." Upstairs. My mental faculties. Because clearly, a woman who refused to provide free childcare services must be suffering from dementia or depression or some other condition that would explain her sudden failure to meet her family's expectations. "I'm fine, Heather. Better than fine, actually." "Mom, this isn't like you. You love spending time with Emma." "I do love spending time with Emma. But I don't love being taken for granted by her parents." The silence that followed lasted so long I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Heather finally spoke again, her voice carried a note of something I'd never heard from her before. Uncertainty. "What do you mean taken for granted?" How could I explain 30 years of accumulated resentment in a single phone conversation? How could I describe the slow erosion of respect that had reduced me from beloved family member to convenient service provider? How could I make her understand that love without reciprocity eventually feels like exploitation? I mean that I've spent decades being available for every emergency, every request, every need, and I've rarely been invited to share in the celebrations that followed. I mean that I'm treated like a utility, useful when required, invisible when not. Another long silence. Then, "Mom, that's not fair. We appreciate everything you do." "Do you? When was the last time you called me just to talk? Not because you needed something. When was the last time I was invited to a family dinner that wasn't a holiday obligation?" I could hear her struggling to formulate a response, and I realized she couldn't remember. Because those invitations had never been extended, those casual conversations had never happened. "We're just all so busy," she said weakly. "Too busy for your mother, but not too busy for her babysitting services or financial assistance." The conversation ended shortly after that, with Heather promising to think about what you've said, and me feeling both proud of my honesty and terrified of the isolation it might bring. Monday brought a different approach. David arrived at my house unannounced, again, but this time he came alone and carrying flowers. Grocery store carnations, nothing expensive but flowers nonetheless. His strategy had shifted from entitlement to appeasement. "Mom, I think we need to talk," he said when I answered the door, his voice carefully modulated to convey concern rather than frustration. "May I come in?" I let him in, more out of curiosity than welcome. We sat in my living room, where he placed the flowers on my coffee table and looked around as if seeing the space for the first time. "This is a nice room," he said, though he'd been in it hundreds of times before. "Very you." The awkward compliment hung between us like a peace offering neither of us knew how to accept. "What did you want to talk about, David?" "I'm worried about you," he began, leaning forward in his chair with the posture of someone trying to project sincerity. "The way you've been acting lately. It's not like you. Heather and I are concerned that maybe you're feeling overwhelmed. Or maybe lonely. Lonely. As if loneliness were a disease that could be cured by providing more unpaid services to ungrateful family members." "I'm not lonely, David. I'm angry." The word seemed to surprise him. In 47 years of being his mother, I had never described myself as angry in his presence. Disappointed, maybe. Hurt occasionally, but never angry. Angry about what? About being taken for granted. About being treated like a convenience rather than a person. About discovering that my family discusses me like I'm a burden they can't wait to get rid of. His face went pale, and I knew he was remembering the barbecue conversation, wondering how much I had overheard. "Mom, if you heard something..." "I heard everything, David. Every word about interventions and boundaries and how embarrassing it is when I try to contribute to family gatherings." We sat in silence for several minutes, the flowers between us wilting slightly in the warm air from my heating vent. David stared at his hands, perhaps finally confronting the reality of how his words had sounded when spoken out loud. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "We shouldn't have talked about you that way. Sorry. Not for how they felt about me, but for getting caught expressing those feelings." "Are you sorry for saying it? Or sorry for meaning it?" Another silence. Longer this time. "I don't know," he admitted. And for the first time in years, his honesty felt genuine rather than strategic. That afternoon, after David left with promises to work on communication and try to do better, I made a decision that would change everything. I walked into my bedroom, pulled out the small wooden box where I kept my important papers, and found the business card my lawyer had given me 3 years ago when I updated my will. It was time to make some changes. Not because I wanted to punish my children, but because I finally understood something that had taken me 79 years to learn. Love that demands nothing in return eventually becomes worthless to the people receiving it. I was about to discover what happens when someone decides they're worth more than being taken for granted, and my children were about to learn what they had actually been taking for granted all these years. The meeting with my lawyer, Richard Sterling, took place on a crisp Wednesday morning in November. His office on Michigan Avenue overlooked Grant Park, where autumn leaves danced in the wind like tiny celebrations of change. I had dressed carefully for this appointment. My best navy suit, the pearl earrings Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary, and a confidence I hadn't worn in years. "Mrs. Walker," Richard said, settling behind his mahogany desk with my file open before him, "you mentioned on the phone that you wanted to make some changes to your will and estate planning. What specifically did you have in mind?" I had practiced this conversation during the 20-minute drive downtown, but actually speaking the words felt both terrifying and liberating. "I want to remove my children as beneficiaries and leave everything to my granddaughter Lily instead." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. He had probably seen every variation of family dysfunction imaginable during his 30 years of estate law. "That's certainly your prerogative, Mrs. Walker. May I ask what prompted this decision?" How could I explain decades of emotional neglect in a way that would make sense to someone who dealt in legal facts rather than wounded feelings? How could I describe the systematic erosion of respect that had reduced me from beloved mother to convenient service provider? "My children view me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved," I said simply. "I've decided to leave my assets to someone who values my presence in her life, not just my ability to solve problems and provide services." Richard nodded and began making notes on a yellow legal pad. "And Lily is David's daughter?" "No, she's Heather's daughter. My younger granddaughter. She's 8 years old now, but she's the only one who seems genuinely happy to see me when I visit." As we discussed the technicalities of trust funds and guardianship arrangements, I felt something shifting inside my chest. Not the painful crack I'd experienced during David's glass comment, but something lighter. The weight of obligation that had pressed down on my shoulders for so many years was beginning to lift. "There's something else," I said as Richard finished outlining the legal documents we would need to prepare. "I want to sell my house." This decision had crystallized during my sleepless night after David's awkward apology visit. I had walked through the rooms of my home, seeing them with new eyes. The dining room where I had hosted countless family dinners for people who now found my presence an inconvenience. The guest bedroom I had maintained for children who preferred hotel stays when they visited Chicago. The kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals for people who no longer invited me to share in their own celebrations. The house had become a museum of my own irrelevance, filled with evidence of a life spent serving people who had slowly learned to take that service for granted. "I want to move to a smaller place. Something that's mine, not ours. Somewhere I can start fresh." Richard smiled for the first time during our meeting. "That sounds like a very healthy decision, Mrs. Walker." That evening, I called a real estate agent and scheduled an assessment for the following week. Then I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I ordered dinner from my favorite Chinese restaurant and ate it straight from the containers while watching a movie I had chosen purely for my own enjoyment. The Kung Pao chicken was perfectly spiced. The Loman noodles were exactly the right texture. And for the first time in months, I ate an entire meal without worrying about anyone else's schedule, dietary restrictions, or approval of my choices. It was the most delicious dinner I'd had in years. The next morning brought the first real test of my newfound independence. My phone rang at 8:30 a.m. with David's number displayed on the screen. This time, I answered. "Mom, thank God. I've been worried sick since our conversation yesterday." "Why?" "Because you seemed so upset. So different. I think maybe we should schedule you an appointment with Dr. Patterson, just to make sure everything's okay." Dr. Patterson was my primary care physician, a kind man in his 60s who had been treating me for minor ailments and annual checkups for the past decade. The suggestion that I needed medical evaluation for the crime of standing up for myself was both insulting and sadly predictable. "I'm not sick, David. I'm awake." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm finally seeing our relationship clearly, and I don't like what I see." I could hear him taking a deep breath, the sound of someone preparing to deliver a speech he had rehearsed. "Mom, I know things haven't been perfect between us lately, but families go through rough patches. We just need to work on communication, maybe spend more time together." "When?" I interrupted. "When exactly do you want to spend more time together? Between your work obligations and social commitments and Melissa's preferences for how your time should be allocated?" Another pause. Maybe you could come to dinner this Sunday. I'll talk to Melissa. You'll talk to Melissa." As if my presence in my son's home required negotiation with his wife. As if I were a problematic relative whose inclusion needed to be carefully managed rather than a grandmother who should be welcomed automatically. "No thank you, David." "No thank you?" "I'm not interested in being a guest in your life when it's convenient for you. I'm not interested in dinner invitations that require spousal approval and advanced scheduling." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear the faint sound of traffic outside David's office building. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been panic. "Mom, what do you want from us?" What did I want? I wanted my son to call me because he missed talking to me, not because he needed something. I wanted to be invited to family celebrations because my presence would add joy to the occasion, not because obligation demanded it. I wanted to be valued for who I was, not tolerated for what I could provide. But I had tried explaining these needs before, and my children had proven incapable of understanding them. Some lessons can only be learned through experience. I don't want anything from you anymore, David. That's the point. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. For 30 years, I've been available for every crisis, every request, every need. And in return, I've been treated like a convenience rather than a person. So I'm removing myself from that dynamic. What does that mean exactly? It means no more emergency babysitting, no more financial assistance, no more problem-solving or crisis management. It means you're going to have to handle your own life without using me as a backup plan. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me that my words had finally penetrated his consciousness. For the first time in our adult relationship, David was confronting the possibility that his safety net might not be permanent. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." But Mom, what if we really need help? What if something happens with Emma? Or if we have a financial emergency, or... Then you'll handle it the way every other adult family handles problems. With your own resources, your own planning, your own support systems. But you're our family. Yes, David, I am. But family relationships require reciprocity to remain healthy. And ours stopped being healthy a long time ago. I hung up before he could respond, and for the first time in decades, I didn't feel guilty about ending a conversation with one of my children on a difficult note. That afternoon, I drove to the local library and did something I hadn't done since before Harold's illness. I checked out books purely for pleasure. 3 novels, a cookbook focused on cooking for one person, and a travel guide to New England bed and breakfasts. As I walked through the library's quiet halls, surrounded by other people pursuing knowledge and entertainment for their own satisfaction, I realized how long it had been since I had engaged in any activity that wasn't somehow connected to my family's needs or expectations. I had forgotten what it felt like to choose something simply because it interested me. That evening, I called Lily directly, something I had never done before without clearing it with Heather first. "Grandma," she answered on the second ring, her voice bright with genuine pleasure. "Mommy's making spaghetti, but she put too much salt in it and now it tastes like the ocean." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. "Would you like me to teach you how to fix oversalted food?" "Yes. Can you come over, please?" "Actually, sweetie, would you like to come to my house this weekend? We could cook together and maybe work on a puzzle. Could we make cookies too? We could make whatever you want." After we hung up, I realized I hadn't asked Heather's permission for this visit, or checked her schedule, or offered to accommodate her preferences. I had simply invited my granddaughter to spend time with me because we both wanted to be together. It felt revolutionary. Friday afternoon brought Heather to my door, looking worried and carrying Lily's overnight bag. "Mom, we need to talk," she said as Lily ran ahead into my living room, already making herself at home. "About what?" "About this phase you're going through. David told me about your conversation, and frankly, I'm concerned." Phase. As if my decision to value myself was a temporary mood swing that would pass if ignored long enough. "I'm not going through a phase, honey. I'm making permanent changes to how I allow myself to be treated." "But Mom, we're your children. We're supposed to be able to count on you. And I'm supposed to be able to count on you, too. When was the last time that happened?" Heather opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Like David, she was discovering that our relationship had become so one-sided, she couldn't remember a recent example of them providing support to me rather than the reverse. That weekend with Lily was a revelation. Without the pressure of providing emergency childcare or accommodating adult schedules, I rediscovered the pure joy of spending time with someone who simply enjoyed my company. We made chocolate chip cookies and burned the first batch because we were too busy laughing at Lily's stories about her school friends. We worked on a 1,000-piece puzzle of the Chicago skyline and talked about her dreams of becoming either a veterinarian or a professional ice skater, depending on which seemed more appealing on any given day. Most importantly, we talked. Not the careful, edited conversations I had grown accustomed to with her parents, but real communication between two people who genuinely cared about each other's thoughts and feelings. Sunday evening, when Heather came to pick up Lily, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, sadness about a visit ending because I had been enjoying myself too much to want it to stop. "Thank you for having me, Grandma," Lily said, hugging me tight at the front door. This was the best weekend ever. As I watched them drive away, I realized that this weekend had been a preview of the life I could have if I stopped allowing myself to be taken for granted. It was time to make that preview a permanent reality. The emergency family meeting was called for a Saturday afternoon in December, 3 weeks after my weekend with Lily. David had orchestrated it with the military precision of someone accustomed to managing business crises, sending a group text that read, "We need to discuss Mom's situation. Saturday 2 p.m. at her house. This can't wait any longer. My situation." As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person making autonomous decisions about my own life. I spent that morning preparing for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. I made coffee in my good china service. The wedding set I'd saved for special occasions that had become increasingly rare over the years. I arranged store-bought cookies on my grandmother's crystal plate. Not because I wanted to provide hospitality, but because I wanted to remind myself of my own worth through the use of beautiful things. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. Through my living room window, I watched my children emerge from their vehicles like a delegation preparing for a hostile negotiation. David wore his most expensive suit, the armor he donned for important business meetings. Heather had chosen a conservative dress and cardigan combination that made her look older, more serious, as if she were attending a funeral. Melissa came too, though she hung back slightly. Her presence clearly intended to provide moral support for David rather than bridge building with me. Even Emma was there, looking confused and uncomfortable in her best dress, clearly uncertain why this gathering required such formal attire and solemn expressions. They arranged themselves in my living room with the studied casualness of people trying to appear relaxed while executing a carefully planned intervention. David took the chair closest to mine, establishing himself as the primary spokesperson. Heather positioned herself on the sofa where she could maintain eye contact with both of us. Melissa chose the chair furthest from me, her body language suggesting she preferred to observe rather than participate directly. Emma sat beside her mother on the sofa, swinging her legs and looking around my living room with the bored resignation of a child who'd been dragged to an adult event she didn't understand. "Mom," David began, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when delivering bad news to clients. "We're here because we're concerned about some of the decisions you've been making lately." Decisions. Plural. As if my refusal to provide free babysitting and my choice to value myself constituted a pattern of poor judgment requiring family intervention. What decisions are those, David? Well, for starters, refusing to watch Emma when we needed you. That's never happened before. You've always been available for family emergencies. It wasn't an emergency. It was a social engagement you chose to prioritize over finding alternative childcare arrangements. That's not the point, Mom. The point is that families support each other. That's what we do. Do we? When was the last time this family supported me? Heather leaned forward, her expression carefully crafted to convey patient concern. Mom, we support you all the time. We call you, we visit. You call when you need something. You visit when it's convenient. That's not support, honey. That's utilization. The word hung in the air between us, clinical and accurate. I had been utilized, not supported. Accessed when needed, ignored when not. That's not fair, Melissa interjected, speaking for the first time since entering my house. David talks about you all the time. He worries about you constantly. He worries about me the way someone worries about an aging appliance, concerned about when it might break down and require replacement, not because he values what it contributes to his daily life. David's face flushed red, the angry color of someone who'd been caught in an uncomfortable truth. That's not true, and you know it. Is it? Then explain to me why I haven't been invited to a single family celebration in over a year. Explain why my presence at your gatherings apparently makes people uncomfortable. Explain why you discuss me like a burden when you think I can't hear you. The silence that followed was thick with recognition. David's face went pale as he realized I was referencing the barbecue conversation, the moment when their true feelings about me had been expressed with casual cruelty. If you heard that conversation, he began weakly. I heard everything. Every word about interventions and boundaries and how embarrassing my contributions are to your carefully planned events. Emma looked up from her quiet fidgeting, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult tension with startling clarity. Daddy, why did you say mean things about Grandma? The question hung in the air like an accusation delivered by innocence itself. David struggled to find words that would explain adult selfishness to a child who still believed families were supposed to love each other unconditionally. Sweetie, sometimes grown-ups say things they don't mean when they're frustrated. But you did mean it, I interrupted quietly. Every word was true. You do find my presence inconvenient. You do wish I would just quietly disappear into some institutional setting where I wouldn't complicate your social calendar or challenge your image of successful adult independence. Heather tried a different approach, her voice taking on the coaxing tone she probably used with difficult patients at the hospital where she worked. Mom, I think you're interpreting things in the worst possible way. We love you. We just want what's best for you. What's best for me? Or what's most convenient for you? They're the same thing. No, Heather. They're not. What's best for me is being treated with respect and included in the family I helped create. What's convenient for you is having access to my resources without the obligation of genuine relationship. David stood up suddenly, his patience apparently exhausted. Okay, Mom. You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, sometimes you can be overwhelming. Yes, sometimes your need for attention feels like pressure. Yes, sometimes it would be easier if you were more independent. The honesty was brutal, but also liberating. Finally, we were having a real conversation instead of dancing around polite fictions. Thank you, I said calmly. I appreciate your honesty. So, where do we go from here? He asked, clearly expecting this acknowledgement to lead to some kind of negotiated resolution where I would modify my behavior to better suit their preferences. I'm selling the house. The announcement hit them like a physical blow. Melissa gasped audibly. Heather's face went white. David sat back down heavily, as if his legs had suddenly stopped supporting him. You're what? Heather whispered. I'm selling the house and moving to a smaller place downtown. Something that fits my actual needs rather than maintaining space for children who don't visit and grandchildren who aren't welcome to stay. But Mom, David said, his voice cracking slightly, this is our family home. This is where we grew up. This is our inheritance. Our inheritance. Finally, the truth emerged. Their primary concern wasn't my well-being or happiness. It was the preservation of assets they expected to inherit eventually. Your inheritance was my love, my sacrifice, my availability for 30 years. You've already received everything I owed you. You can't just sell our childhood home, Heather protested, tears starting to form in her eyes. What about the memories? What about Emma's memories of this place? What memories? I asked gently. Emma has been here exactly 4 times in the past year, always as part of some obligation you felt you had to fulfill. She has no emotional attachment to this house because you've never allowed her to develop one. I reached into the manila folder I'd placed on the coffee table that morning and pulled out the real estate listing agreement I'd signed 3 days earlier. It's already done. The house goes on the market Monday morning. David grabbed the papers, scanning them with the desperate intensity of someone searching for a loophole in a contract that would destroy his future plans. This is crazy, Mom. You can't make decisions this big without consulting us. We're your family. You're absolutely right. You are my family, which is why I'm also changing my will. I pulled out the second set of documents, watching as their faces went through various stages of shock, confusion, and growing panic. I've removed both of you as beneficiaries. Everything goes to Lily now. The proceeds from the house sale, my savings, my jewelry. Everything. The silence that followed was complete. Even Emma stopped swinging her legs, sensing that something monumentally important was happening in the adult world around her. You can't do this, Melissa said finally, her voice shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. This is financial elder abuse. Someone is manipulating you into making these decisions. The only person who manipulated me was myself, for 30 years, into believing that sacrificial love would eventually be rewarded with genuine affection. I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in decades. David was staring at the legal documents as if they might change their content through the force of his disbelief. Mom, please. We can work this out. We can change. We can be better. Can you? Or are you simply panicking because your safety net is disappearing? We're panicking because we love you and we don't want to lose you. You lost me years ago, David. You just never noticed because I kept showing up anyway. I stood up and walked to my kitchen, leaving them to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. When I returned with a fresh pot of coffee, a hostess habit I couldn't completely abandon even during family warfare, they were huddled together in urgent, whispered conversation. We've been talking, Heather said as I refilled their cups, and we think maybe family counseling would be helpful. Someone neutral who could help us work through these communication issues. Communication issues. They were still trying to frame this as a problem that could be solved through better dialogue, rather than acknowledging the fundamental disrespect that had poisoned our relationships. I'm not interested in counseling. I replied calmly. I'm interested in living the rest of my life with dignity and self-respect. But what about us? David asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine desperation that might have moved me 6 months earlier. What about our relationship? That depends entirely on what kind of relationship you want to have with me. If you want a mother who exists to serve your convenience, you'll be disappointed. If you want a person worth knowing and spending time with, I'm available for that conversation. Of course we want a relationship with you, Heather protested. Then call me sometime when you don't need anything. Invite me to dinner because you enjoy my company, not because it's a holiday obligation. Include me in your celebrations because my presence would add joy to the occasion. We will, David said quickly. We promise we'll do better. I looked at my adult children, seeing them clearly for the first time in years. They were frightened, desperate, promising changes they had no intention of making beyond whatever temporary modifications might be necessary to restore their access to my resources. I hope you will, I said quietly, but I'm not waiting around to find out. An hour later, after they had exhausted their arguments, made their promises and realized that no amount of negotiation would change my decisions, they gathered their coats and prepared to leave. At the front door, Emma broke away from the adult group and ran back to hug me around the waist. I love you, Grandma, she whispered, even if you sell your house. I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know. As I watched them drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The profound relief of finally telling the truth about my own worth. The hardest part was over. Now I could begin the work of rebuilding my life around people who actually wanted me in it. 3 months later, I woke up in my new apartment as sunlight streamed through windows I had chosen myself, in a space that belonged entirely to me. The one-bedroom unit on the 15th floor of a converted warehouse building overlooked Lake Michigan, and every morning I stood at those windows with my coffee, watching the water change colors as the sun climbed higher into the sky. This morning ritual had become sacred to me, not because of any religious significance, but because it represented something I had never allowed myself before. Time that belonged only to me, with no agenda beyond my own peace and pleasure. The apartment was smaller than my old house, but it felt infinitely larger. Every piece of furniture had been chosen because I loved it, not because it served someone else's needs or fit someone else's decorating vision. The walls were painted a warm sage green that reminded me of spring gardens. The sofa was cream-colored leather, impractical for a family home, but perfect for a woman who no longer had to worry about children spilling juice or tracking mud across expensive upholstery. I had kept only the possessions that brought me joy or held genuine sentimental value. My grandmother's china, Harold's favorite reading chair, the photo albums chronicling my life before it became consumed by other people's emergencies. Everything else had been sold or donated, including 30 years of accumulated family detritus that had once seemed too precious to discard. The house had sold within 2 weeks of being listed, to a young couple with twin toddlers who promised to fill it with the kind of joyful chaos I remembered from my own children's early years. Watching them sign the papers, seeing their excitement about creating family memories in rooms where my own family had slowly learned to take me for granted, I felt something unexpected, happiness for them, and relief for myself. The move downtown had changed more than just my address. It had changed my entire relationship with my own life. For the first time in decades, I was living in the present tense rather than constantly anticipating the next crisis that would require my attention. Tuesday mornings had become my favorite part of the week. That's when I volunteered at the Lincoln Park Community Center, reading to children in their after-school program. The kids ranged in age from 5 to 10, and they gathered around my chair in a semicircle of eager faces, completely absorbed in whatever story I was sharing that day. Last week, I had been reading Charlotte's Web to them, and when I finished the chapter where Charlotte dies, 7-year-old Marcus had raised his hand solemnly. "Mrs. Margaret, why did Charlotte have to die? She was the best character." I had looked into his serious brown eyes and realized that this was exactly the kind of conversation I had been starving for. Genuine connection with someone who valued my thoughts and presence, not because I could solve their problems, but because they enjoyed being with me. Sometimes the best characters teach us the most important lessons, I had told him. Charlotte showed Wilbur how to be brave and kind, and those gifts live on even after she's gone. Marcus had nodded thoughtfully, and later that day his grandmother told me he had spent the entire car ride home talking about Mrs. Margaret's story about being brave. These children knew nothing about my bank account, my real estate assets, or my ability to provide emergency babysitting services. They simply enjoyed my company, looked forward to our time together, and occasionally hugged me goodbye with the unconscious affection of people who liked me for who I was, rather than what I could do for them. Thursday afternoons, I had started taking watercolor painting classes at the art center 3 blocks from my apartment. I had always wanted to try painting, but had convinced myself I was too old to start, too busy with family obligations, too practical to pursue something purely for pleasure. Now, at 79, I was discovering that my hands, the same hands my son had criticized for dropping glasses, were actually quite steady when holding a paintbrush. My first attempts had been clumsy, but my instructor, a patient woman named Sarah who was younger than my own children, encouraged experimentation over perfection. Art isn't about creating masterpieces, she had told me during my second class. It's about expressing something that lives inside you and finding joy in the process of bringing it out. Last week, I had painted a landscape of the view from my apartment windows, the lake stretching toward the horizon, morning light dancing on the water, a small sailboat in the distance. When I stepped back to look at the finished piece, I was surprised by how peaceful it made me feel. "That's beautiful, Margaret," Sarah had said, standing beside me to admire the painting. "You've captured something really special there. The feeling of space and possibility. Space and possibility." Yes, that was exactly what I had been painting without even realizing it. Friday evenings had become social occasions again, but on my own terms. I had joined a book club that met at the independent bookstore in my neighborhood, a group of 8 women ranging in age from 45 to 82 who gathered monthly to discuss literature and share wine and cheese. These women knew me only as Margaret, the new member who had thoughtful opinions about contemporary fiction and always brought excellent homemade cookies to share. They didn't know about my family drama or my recent life changes. They simply enjoyed my contributions to their discussions and had gradually begun including me in their post-meeting dinners at nearby restaurants. Last month, when I had mentioned in passing that I was learning to paint, 3 of them had asked if they could see my work sometime. Their interest felt genuine rather than polite, and I had found myself promising to bring photographs of my paintings to the next meeting. Saturday mornings belonged to Lily. Every weekend, she took the train downtown from her mother's apartment to spend the day with me. These visits had become the highlight of my week, not because I felt obligated to provide childcare, but because I genuinely enjoyed my granddaughter's company, and she seemed to enjoy mine. Today, she was sitting at my kitchen table working on a jigsaw puzzle while I prepared our traditional Saturday lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. At 8 years old, Lily had developed strong opinions about everything from puzzle strategies to sandwich preparation techniques. "Grandma, you're supposed to put butter on both sides of the bread," she informed me seriously. "That's what makes it golden and crispy." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, adding more butter to the pan. "Where did you learn that?" "From watching you, silly. You always make the best grilled cheese sandwiches." This casual compliment hit me harder than she could have known. When was the last time one of my adult children had complimented my cooking or acknowledged that I had taught them anything worth knowing? "Grandma, can I ask you something?" Lily said, looking up from her puzzle with the serious expression she wore when contemplating important questions. "Of course, sweetheart. Why doesn't Mommy visit you very much anymore? She used to talk about you all the time, but now she gets quiet when I mention you." I considered how to answer this question honestly without burdening an 8-year-old with adult family dysfunction. Sometimes grown-ups need time to think about how they want their relationships to work, I said carefully. "Your mommy and I are figuring some things out. Are you mad at her?" "I'm not mad, honey. I'm just learning to take better care of myself, and sometimes that means making changes that other people don't understand right away." Lily nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Like when I decided I didn't want to be friends with Jessica anymore because she only wanted to play with me when her other friends were busy. The parallel was so accurate it took my breath away. Yes, sweetheart, exactly like that. Well, I think you're perfect just the way you are, she declared, returning her attention to the puzzle with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Perfect just the way I am. When was the last time anyone had told me that? That afternoon, after Lily had returned home on the train with a care package of leftover cookies and a new book I'd bought for her, I sat in my reading chair with a cup of tea and reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 3 months. I was no longer waiting by the phone for crisis calls that never came. I was no longer organizing my schedule around other people's emergencies and social obligations. I was no longer measuring my worth by my usefulness to people who had learned to take that usefulness for granted. Instead, I was painting watercolor landscapes and reading to children who hugged me goodbye. I was discussing literature with women who valued my opinions and cooking elaborate meals for one person because I deserved to eat well. I was sleeping through the night without anxiety and waking up excited about the day ahead. The woman in the mirror looked different now, not just older, but more present. The permanent tension lines around my eyes had softened. My posture was straighter, more confident. I had started wearing colors again instead of the neutral tones I had adopted to avoid drawing attention to myself in other people's spaces. Last week, I had bought a red wool coat that made me feel bold and visible in the best possible way. When I wore it to book club, one of the women had told me it was a perfect color for me. "Red suits you, Margaret," she had said. "You should wear it more often." Red suited me. I was learning that many things suited me when I stopped trying to make myself smaller and more convenient for other people's comfort. My phone rang less frequently now, but the calls I received were more meaningful. Lily called me most weekday evenings just to tell me about her day at school. Sarah from the art center had started texting me links to gallery exhibitions she thought I might enjoy. The women from book club included me in their group messages about restaurant recommendations and cultural events. These connections felt different from the relationships I had maintained with my children, lighter but also deeper, based on mutual enjoyment rather than obligation and emergency response. David and Heather had called sporadically since our confrontation, their voices carefully modulated to convey concern and affection while avoiding any acknowledgement of the issues that had led to my departure from their lives. Their conversations felt performative, like people reading from a script titled, "How to Talk to Your Mother When You're Trying to Get Back in Her Will." I listened politely, but didn't provide the reassurance they were clearly seeking. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and my children were finally experiencing life without the safety net they had taken for granted for so many years. The truth was, I didn't miss the constant anxiety of being perpetually on call for other people's crises. I didn't miss the hurt feelings that accumulated from being excluded from celebrations while being expected to provide support during difficult times. I didn't miss the exhaustion of loving people who seemed to view that love as an unlimited resource they could access without reciprocation. What I had found in place of those painful dynamics was something I had almost forgotten existed: peace. Real peace. The kind that comes from living authentically, rather than according to other people's expectations and convenience. As the sun set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reminded me of my watercolor attempts, I realized I was no longer the woman who had stood in her kitchen 3 months ago, picking up broken glass while her son criticized her competence. I was someone entirely new. Someone who had remembered her own worth and decided to live accordingly. And for the first time in 30 years, I was truly happy. 1 year later, I stood at the window of the Margaret Ann Walker Children's Reading Room, watching families arrive for the grand opening of the literacy center I had funded with the proceeds from my house sale. The autumn sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating shelves lined with thousands of new books and comfortable reading nooks designed specifically for children and their families. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had created a space dedicated to bringing families together through shared stories, at a time when my own family remained fractured by years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. But perhaps that made the gift even more meaningful. I understood the value of genuine connection precisely because I had experienced its absence. The reading room was everything I had envisioned during those long nights in my new apartment, planning how to transform my pain into something beautiful and lasting. Child-sized tables and chairs painted in bright primary colors, a storytelling corner with a rocking chair that reminded me of the one I used to sit in when my children were small, interactive displays that would teach children about different cultures and countries through literature. Most importantly, it was a space where children would be valued for who they were, not what they could provide to the adults in their lives. "Mrs. Walker?" A young voice interrupted my contemplation. I turned to see Marcus, the 7-year-old from my volunteer reading sessions, tugging on his grandmother's hand as he pointed in my direction. "Mrs. Walker, look! This whole room has your name on it." His grandmother, a woman about my age named Dorothy, smiled warmly as she approached. "Marcus hasn't stopped talking about this place since he heard about it. He's been counting down the days until it opened. Can you read to us here too?" Marcus asked eagerly. "In your special chair?" The rocking chair in the storytelling corner had been positioned precisely where I could see the lake through the windows, where the afternoon light would be perfect for reading, where children could gather close without feeling crowded. I had spent considerable time with the designers, ensuring every detail would contribute to the kind of warm, inclusive atmosphere I had always tried to create in my own home, before I learned that warmth and inclusion could be taken advantage of by people who confused love with convenience. "I'll be here every Tuesday afternoon," I told Marcus, watching his face light up with anticipation. "And anyone who wants to listen is welcome to join us." As more families arrived for the opening ceremony, I noticed something that filled me with quiet satisfaction. Multiple generations were represented in almost every group: grandparents holding hands with toddlers, parents carrying babies while school-aged children ran ahead to explore the new space, teenagers helping elderly relatives navigate the entrance. These were families who understood that each generation had something valuable to offer the others, who saw relationships as opportunities for mutual enrichment rather than one-sided exploitation. The formal dedication ceremony began at 3 o'clock. The mayor spoke about the importance of literacy in building strong communities. The head librarian thanked the anonymous donor who had made this expansion possible. I had insisted on remaining unnamed in all official documents, wanting the focus to remain on the children who would benefit rather than the woman who had written the check. But as I listened to speech after speech about the transformative power of books and reading, I found myself thinking about a different kind of transformation entirely. 18 months ago, I had been a woman who measured her worth by her usefulness to people who had learned to take that usefulness for granted. I had defined myself through service, sacrifice, and availability, never questioning whether the recipients of my devotion actually valued me as a person or simply as a resource to be accessed when needed. Now, I was someone who had learned to set boundaries, to choose relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need for connection, to find meaning in activities that brought me joy rather than activities that brought others convenience. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been nights when the silence of my phone felt like punishment rather than peace, when I wondered if I had been too harsh in my judgments, too quick to burn bridges that might have been repaired with patience and communication. But then I would remember the conversation I had overheard at David's barbecue, the casual cruelty with which my family had discussed my perceived shortcomings, the way they had planned to manage me like a problem rather than love me like a person. I would remember the decades of emergency phone calls that were never followed by invitations to celebrations, the financial assistance that was never acknowledged, the emotional support that was never reciprocated, and I would know that I had made the right choice. During the reception following the dedication ceremony, a young mother approached me with a toddler balanced on her hip and a preschooler clinging to her leg. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, "but I heard someone mention that you're the donor who made this possible. I just wanted to thank you. My kids and I come to the library every week, and having this beautiful new space, it means everything to families like ours." I looked at her tired but grateful face, at the children who clearly adored her despite her obvious exhaustion, and I saw something I had never quite managed to achieve with my own children, a relationship built on genuine affection rather than obligatory connection. "It was my pleasure," I told her honestly. "I hope your family enjoys many happy hours here." "We will," she assured me. "And I promise we'll take good care of everything. This place is too special to treat carelessly. Too special to treat carelessly. If only my own children had understood that people, like beautiful spaces, deserve to be treated with care and respect rather than taken for granted. That evening, I returned to my apartment with a sense of completion I hadn't expected to feel. The Literacy Center represented more than just a charitable donation. It was proof that I could transform my pain into something meaningful, that the love I had poured into ungrateful recipients could be redirected toward people who would appreciate and honor it. As I prepared my simple dinner of salmon and roasted vegetables, food I had chosen because I enjoyed it, not because it accommodated someone else's dietary preferences or schedule, my phone rang. Heather's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail as I had done so many times over the past year. But something made me answer. "Hello, Heather." "Mom." Her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, a heaviness that suggested this wasn't going to be another performative check-in call. "I saw the article about the Literacy Center in today's Tribune. There was a photo of you at the dedication ceremony." I had forgotten about the newspaper photographer who had been circulating through the crowd, capturing images of families exploring the new space. The journalist had mentioned wanting to include a photo of the donor if possible, and I had reluctantly agreed to be photographed while reading to a small group of children. The article said the donor wished to remain anonymous, but the caption under your photo identified you as a community volunteer and literacy advocate. "Mom, did you donate the money for that entire reading room?" "Yes." A long silence followed, during which I could hear Heather breathing carefully, as if she were trying to control her emotional response. That must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars." "It did. Money from selling the house?" "Among other things, yes." Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. "I read the whole article, Mom, about how the center will serve families from all economic backgrounds, how it's designed to be a safe space where children can develop a love of reading and learning. It's beautiful. It's exactly the kind of thing you would do. Exactly the kind of thing I would do." For the first time in our conversation, Heather sounded like she was talking about someone she actually knew, rather than someone she was obligated to maintain contact with. "Thank you," I said simply. "Mom, I need to tell you something. About this past year. About the way things ended between us. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about being taken for granted, about us treating you like a resource instead of a person." I waited, not sure whether this was leading toward genuine insight or another attempt to manipulate me back into my old role. "You were right," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "We did take you for granted. I took you for granted. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that it took losing you for me to understand what we were doing." The apology hung between us, and I found myself thinking about forgiveness. Not the quick, reflexive forgiveness I had always offered in the past, but the slower, more considered forgiveness that comes after genuine acknowledgement of harm done. "I appreciate you saying that, Heather. Do you think there's a way for us to have a relationship again? A real one. Not like before. Something based on actually caring about each other instead of just obligation and convenience." The question I had been waiting for, the one that would determine whether my family could learn from their mistakes or whether they were simply missing the services I used to provide. "What would that look like?" I asked. "I don't know exactly, but maybe I could start by asking how you're doing without needing anything from you. Maybe I could invite you to dinner because I want to spend time with you, not because it's Mother's Day or your birthday. Maybe I could call just to hear your voice. Maybe." The word was tentative, uncertain, but it carried more hope than any of the promises my children had made during our confrontation the previous year. "That sounds like a good place to start," I said carefully. "Mom, I love you. Not because of what you can do for me, but because you're my mother and you're an amazing person, and I should have been telling you that all along." For the first time in our conversation, I felt tears forming in my eyes. Not tears of hurt or frustration, but tears of relief that maybe, finally, my daughter was beginning to see me as a person worth loving. "I love you too, honey." After we hung up, I sat in my reading chair watching the lights twinkle across Lake Michigan, thinking about second chances and the courage it takes to rebuild relationships on healthier foundations. I didn't know whether Heather would follow through on her tentative promises, whether David would eventually reach the same realizations, whether my family could learn to value me for who I was rather than what I could provide. But I knew something now that I hadn't known 18 months ago. I would be fine either way. I had learned to love myself enough to require that others love me too. I had discovered that my worth wasn't dependent on my usefulness to people who couldn't be bothered to show up for my life unless they needed something from it. Most importantly, I had created a life filled with genuine connections, meaningful activities, and the kind of peace that comes from living authentically rather than according to other people's expectations. The broken glass that had started this journey had been swept away long ago, but the wisdom it had taught me remained. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with something precious shattering completely, forcing us to examine the pieces and decide which ones are worth keeping and which ones need to be left behind. I was no longer the woman who dropped the glass. I was the woman who had learned that some things are worth breaking for, including the patterns that keep us small and the relationships that diminish rather than elevate us. And in letting go of the family I thought I needed, I had found the family I actually deserved. A community of people who chose to include me in their lives because my presence added value, not because obligation demanded it. The sunset painted the lake in shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in my 79 years, I felt completely at home in my own life. Have you ever felt invisible to the people you've given everything to? Have you ever wondered if your love was being taken for granted by the very people who should cherish it most? If this story resonates with you, please share it in the comments below. And if you found hope in Margaret's journey, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remind us we're not alone in our struggles, and that it's never too late to choose our own worth over other people's convenience.